Hey everyone, welcome back. One question that just keeps popping up and sparking debate is, how much of race is actually biological?
Mhm.
That's a big one, right?
Ah,
Touches on science,
yeah.
identity, who we are. So we're going to take a deep dive into that today. And to really get a handle on it, we got a whole mix of sources.
Yeah, we've got some interesting stuff to work with. We've got YouTube transcripts, some academics, some just folks talking about their experiences, articles on transracialism, that whole debate.
Yeah.
And of course, gotta love the science. Genetics, even genome editing, plus some online forum threads. Always interesting to see what people are saying out there. So yeah, lots to unpack. The goal is to synthesize all these different views, help you make sense of it all, without getting lost in the weeds.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess one of the first things that really jumps out from these sources is this whole idea of transracialism. It's like a really current debate, right?
Mm.
Seems to be connected to how we're understanding transgender identity better these days. And it pushes us to think about, where do the lines really lie when we talk about race?
Yeah, and the Simon Cushing video transcript, it brings up what they call a moderate view. Basically, they're saying, okay, transgender identity, that's valid, changing your sex, gender, that's possible. But when it comes to transracialism, they draw a line there. They say, nope, you can't just identify as a different race from what you were assigned at birth. And apparently, this Tell article kind of explored that, and just for considering those ideas, it caused a bit of a stir.
Oh, wow. So just talking about it was controversial, huh?
Yeah, seems like it.
Okay, so then the Cushing video mentions this other thing, the what they call the radical view. And that one goes even further, right?
Right. So their logic is if someone can authentically transition in terms of their sex, why not their race too?
Yeah.
But even among people who strongly support transgender rights, this view isn't that common. It's definitely out there, but it's not the majority view.
Makes you think, though, about the whole question of how much biology plays into all of this, right? Not just race, but even defining sex.
Totally. Actually, the Cushing video has this really interesting bit about defining biological sex. It's not as straightforward as you might think.
Really? I mean, it seems pretty simple. You're either male or female.
Well, they talk about how initially the understanding was yep, it's all decided at conception, male or female, end of story. But biologically, it's way more complicated than that. Turns out, in early development, we all basically start off on a female trajectory.
Well, wait, really? We all start off female.
Yeah, apparently. It's only later on with certain hormones and stuff in the womb that some develop in a male direction.
Wow, I never knew that. So even something that we think of as totally biological, like our sex,
Mhm.
can be kind of, I don't know, fuzzy around the edges.
Exactly. And if defining sex is that complex, it makes you wonder about defining race biologically, right? It's a whole other level of complicated.
Right. So let's talk about that. What does science actually have to say about a biological basis for race?
Well, based on what we've got here, the overall scientific consensus is that race, the way we usually think about it, is mostly a social thing. It's not really a clear-cut genetic thing.
Hmm. But isn't there some genetic basis for race?
Okay, so a key piece of evidence that often comes up is the Human Genome Project. And what they found was actually pretty surprising. It turns out there's way more genetic variation within racial groups than between them. Like if you take a group of people who identify as Asian, the genetic diversity within that group is actually bigger than the average difference between Asian and European populations.
So it's less about clear genetic boundaries between races and more about what? Like
Eh,
a spectrum.
exactly. It's more like a gradient, a gradual shift in genetic variations across different regions.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not like you can just look at someone's genes and say, oh, yep, you're definitely this race or that race.
Nope, not really. This race human categorization Wikipedia article we have actually mentions that a bunch of scientists got together and they basically said, look, even if there are some correlations between genetic ancestry and the racial categories we use, the meaning we give those categories, that's all social and political stuff. Like the fact that we even divide people into these groups in the first place, that's a social choice. It's not dictated by our genes.
Hmm. So even if there are some genetic differences, the way we interpret them, the categories we create, that's all us. We made that up.
Pretty much. And to make that point even clearer, the article talks about this idea of clines and clusters in genetic variation. Imagine a landscape with all these different colors, and the colors kind of blend into each other, right? It's not like there's a sharp line between blue and green. They sort of merge together. That's kind of like how genetic differences between human populations work. It's mostly gradual changes in the frequency of certain gene variants, not completely separate genetic markers that say, this is race A and this is race B.
So it's more like a rainbow than a paint by numbers set.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And get this, the article mentions this survey of biologists and developmental psychologists, and a huge chunk of them actually said they straight up disagree with the idea that there are biological races within Homo sapiens.
Wow. So it's not just a fringe idea then. It seems like the mainstream scientific view is that biological races don't really exist.
Exactly. And even when scientists can figure out someone's race from their bones, that's more about how they were probably categorized socially when they were alive, not proof that there's some biological essence of race in their bones.
Okay, so this all seems to be pointing towards race being more about society than biology. And that brings us to this whole social construct thing, right?
Yeah, and the ethnicity Wikipedia article really gets into that. It talks about this debate between primordialism and constructivism. Primordialism is like ethnic groups are ancient and their characteristics are like set in stone. But constructivism says, nope, they're created by society. Their identities are shaped by history, by power dynamics, all that stuff. And in the last century, the constructivist view has really gained ground.
The article also gives a pretty clear definition of an ethnic group. It's like a named social category based on shared experiences, or maybe the experiences of their ancestors. And there's a big psychological component to it, right? Like a sense of belonging, a shared identity.
Absolutely. And the article talks about how some earlier theories tried to explain inequality by saying certain groups had cultural deficits. But Omi and Winant, they came along and were like, hold up, you're totally missing the bigger picture here. Focusing on cultural deficits just ignores all the social and political stuff that actually creates those inequalities in the first place, like the systems of power that keep certain groups down.
It's like blaming the victim instead of looking at the system, right?
Yeah, basically. And it's interesting, the article even points out that the word ethnic itself used to mean heathen or pagan, which goes to show how much our understanding of these group identities can change over time.
Yeah, language is definitely powerful. Okay, so all this talk about shifting identities and the social side of things, it makes me think about those who identify as transracial.
Yeah, that's where things get even more complex and honestly kind of heated sometimes. So the transracial identity Wikipedia article defines it as people who identify with a race different from the one they were assigned at birth. But there's a lot of controversy around this term because it's also been used in the context of transracial adoption.
Or like when someone of one race is adopted into a family of a different race.
Exactly. And for those folks, their experience is unique and complex. So some feel like using transracial in other contexts might not be appropriate, that it might overshadow those experiences. But this thesis on transracialism we have, it argues that language can evolve and have multiple meanings.
So are they saying there's room for both understandings of transracial?
Yeah, it seems like it. So some people who were transracially adopted, and others too, are exploring this idea of transracial identity because they feel a deep disconnect from their birth race and a strong connection to another race.
The thesis goes into some personal stories from transracial individuals, right?
Yeah, it does. And it's pretty powerful stuff. They talk about struggling to fit in, feeling like they're constantly being judged as inauthentic.
Must be tough. Always feeling like you have to prove yourself.
Definitely. And in this Reddit thread, the diracial community, there's this user, Yukisatopan, who talks about how they've felt connected to Japanese culture their whole life. They really want to be accepted as Japanese. It's like a deep-seated feeling that goes beyond just like liking the culture.
So it's not just a superficial thing then.
Yeah.
Sounds like it goes way deeper than that.
Yeah, for sure. And in this Discord forum on transracialism, people are asking questions like, when did you first feel this way? And what does this connection feel like? It's clear they're really trying to understand themselves and their identities.
Makes sense. A big thing to grapple with.
It is. And it's important to remember that wanting to identify with another race isn't the same as fetishizing that race. This trace info source really makes that point. It's about genuine connection, not some kind of creepy fascination.
Right, that's a good distinction to make. Okay, so we talked about the social side of race, but let's be real. There are people who argue that transracialism is just not a thing. Like, that race is biologically fixed and you can't change that.
Yeah, and this For Free Do video makes a very practical point about that. They basically say, look, even with all our technology, we can't actually change someone's genes or their bone structure in a way that would truly make them look like a different race. Like, you can get plastic surgery and stuff, but that's just on the surface.
It's not really changing who you are at a fundamental level.
Right. And the video also brings up another concern, which is that people who identify as transracial might not understand the lived experiences of the race they identify with. Like, they haven't faced the same discrimination, the same struggles.
Yeah, that's a valid point. It's one thing to identify with the culture, but it's another thing to actually live it, to experience the downsides along with the good stuff.
Totally. And in the Cushing video, they talk about this difference between intrinsic and extrinsic racism. Intrinsic racism is like a natural preference for your own group. Extrinsic racism is when you believe negative things about other groups, and that leads to prejudice and harm. But both of these ideas depend on the belief that there are actual racial categories to begin with.
So they're saying that even if you think there's good racism and bad racism, you're still buying into the idea that race is a real thing.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. And this Brubaker article also points out that race is treated way more seriously than gender in a lot of societies. Like, you can be more fluid with your gender identity, but race is often seen as fixed.
And there's that quote from Jody Armour that really sticks with me. He said, Michael Brown could be transracial. It's a stark reminder that, especially for Black people, race isn't something you can just choose or change. It's a lived reality with very real consequences.
Absolutely. And speaking of realities, the Cushing video brings up this whole issue of passing. Like, some African Americans have lighter skin and can pass as white.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other layer of complexity.
Right. And then there's the question that Charles Mills asks. If someone can successfully pass as white, are they white? Like, what actually defines someone's race? Is it how they see themselves? Is it how society sees them? It's a tricky question.
Kemp has big implications for things like transracial adoption, too.
Mhm.
Like, if a child is raised in a white family but is biologically Black, how does that affect their racial identity?
Yeah, lots to think about there.
Okay, so as we wrap up, we got to touch on the ethical side of all this.
Right. The RCTA Understanding RCTA article talks about cultural appropriation, which is a big concern. It's like, if you're going to adopt parts of another culture, you got to do it with respect and understanding, otherwise it can be really harmful.
Makes sense. It's about appreciating a culture, not just taking what you want from it without any regard for its meaning.
Exactly. And the article also ties this into issues of systemic racism and colorism, where lighter skin is often seen as better. Like, even within racial groups, there's prejudice based on skin tone.
Wow, it's like there's just no escaping it, is there?
Unfortunately, not really. And the Cushing video talks about how reparations for historical injustices should be directed towards people who've actually experienced those injustices because of their ancestry, not just because someone identifies with that group later in life.
Yeah, that's a whole ethical debate right there. Okay, so it's clear that there's no easy answer to the question of how much of race is biological. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's about way more than just our genes.
Totally. We've looked at all these sources, and the main takeaway is that while genes play a role, race is mostly a social construct. There's more genetic diversity within racial groups than between them. But then you have the experiences of transracial individuals and the realities of racism, and that shows just how tangled up biology and society really are.
So, as we leave you with this, we want to pose a final question, something to chew on,
Yeah.
It's not something we covered directly in these sources, but it builds on what we've been talking about. So we're learning more and more about how fluid identity can be, right?
Mhm.
And then you have these crazy advances in gene editing, like TALENs and MAGE, which let us literally change our DNA. So what happens when those two things collide? How will our understanding of race and identity change in the future? Could the line between biological and social get even blurrier?
Yeah, that's a big question. And honestly, kind of mind-blowing to think about. I mean, if we can literally change our genes, what does that mean for how we define ourselves and each other? What happens to the categories we've created? It's fascinating and a little bit scary all at the same time.
Definitely something to ponder. So we encourage you to go back and check out the sources we talked about. Think about your own views on all this. It's a conversation that's not going away anytime soon.
Absolutely. And as our understanding of identity continues to evolve, this is a topic we'll probably be revisiting again and again.
This has been The Deep Dive, folks. Thanks for joining us as we dove into the big question. How much of race is actually biological? See you next time.